Parliament was back this week, but external events continue to dominate.
I'm declaring a public health emergency of international concern.
And the federal government is being called on to act quickly.
We will continue to do everything we can to support those families, to secure their return to Canada.
We must be ready for the possible situation in which things would get worse.
It's time for the government to get off their platitudes and their generalities and start revealing to Canadians what their specific plans are.
So how is the government handling all of this? At issue here to look at that response and everything that's already happened in this first week back. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal tonight, Althea Raj here in Ottawa, and Aaron Wary is also here in Ottawa tonight. Good of you to join us all. Okay, let's start with the coronavirus, now a global health emergency. The WHO says just late today. The government has been trying to find a way to get Canadians home that want to get home. And it is complicated. I'm not going to say this is an easy task, complicated further by the fact that they are dealing with China. But what does it tell us about how the government responds to these kinds of crises, these moments where you do have to take some action and move fairly quickly? Chantal.
At best it can. It's easy to say the government should be on standby for any crisis with planes ready to do whatever. But in this case, for instance, we do not have the kind of consular boots on the ground that larger countries may have. It's not because there are 200 Canadians who want to be airlifted home that they are in one location in a country that is curtailed travel from city to city. And then you have to think about the fact that once they land, do you let people spread out? And eventually, if they don't feel well, go to crowded emergency rooms where they stand if they are sick to make other people sick.
Yeah, I mean, that's just that's a good example of the complexities. And I think that the Foreign Affairs Minister today also suggested that you have to have a manifest of all the passengers that you're willing to share with every level of Chinese authorities. So it's a huge task. Are they handling it the right way, do you think, Althea?
I don't know, because I don't actually know what the plan is, and they don't seem to know what their plan is either. I think that, I've worked in consular, so declaring a little conflict here, 20 years ago. I think the government has learned a lot from, other evacuations, like Lebanon, for example. Yeah. I do genuinely think public servants do the most that they can. What is interesting to me is, we've had this, we had the Ukrainian flight being shot down. Consular cases are increasingly a big thing around the world, right? You have more and more Canadians traveling. There were just the U.S. alone, there were more than 40 million trips last year. People are moving, and we need to do things when things go wrong. And there's an expectation, especially from people who, their relationship with the federal government is not like a relationship with your local government. Unless you're getting EI or, CPP, you have very little reason to be calling the federal government unless it's like an immigration case or a consular case. And in the last cabinet shuffle and the parliamentary secretary is being doled out, there was not a parliamentary secretary for consular affairs. And you have, Almar Al-Gabra, who's now in charge of kind of dealing with the families who are affected by the crisis in Iran. And now we have the parliamentary secretary for foreign affairs dealing with this. But you should have somebody, and arguably maybe you should even have a junior minister that does consular affairs.
That's an interesting idea. I mean, I think some of the delay as well that we've seen, Aaron, was created by the fact that the Canadians that were there hadn't necessarily registered with the government. So if anything, it's also a lesson about when you're traveling overseas about the importance of that, because the numbers climbed up really quickly as people started to register.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want to necessarily compare crises here because they're all sort of different, but this government has shown itself on NAFTA, on the plane in Iran, capable of sort of fairly quickly reacting and marshaling its forces as much as it can to deal with a situation and to be proactive and sort of nimble with it. I think in this case, there's a couple complications. One is just the very nature of the problem, the very nature of an infectious disease and dealing with that as a threat. And second, I think very early in this one, it seems like the opposition is pretty ready to challenge how the government's handling it and even criticize how the government's handling it. And I don't know that you saw that in previous crises. The government seems to be taking I guess, a fairly proactive approach in terms of communications, in terms of putting its ministers out there. But in this one, as much as it's too early to sort of say whether it's, they're succeeding or failing at it, I think there's a certain feeling of like how hard this is to sort of put your hands around and say, okay, we've got this, we know what we're doing, and it's running up against that fact that the opposition is not at all shy, really, in the early going of challenging the government on this.
Yeah, and that might be the difference that they're experiencing as a minority government for the first time. You talked about one of the things that they managed fairly well, and that was NAFTA. Some of the legislation tabled yesterday, another piece today. Here's what Chrystia Freeland had to say about that.
I was very happy yesterday to see the Conservatives and the NDP and the Greens voting for the deal. I think our country is stronger when in some key areas we can have a broad national consensus on how we proceed as a country.
So I don't want to talk about the new NAFTA because we've talked about that a lot. I would rather talk about the fact that the government is going to get this through. It seems like it's going to be a fairly easy win, and whether they should be wary of getting overly confident that this is how the rest of things will go. Chantal.
I don't think that anyone anywhere is under any delusion that this is kind of the prototype of things in Parliament going forward, for a very simple reason. Usually in a minority situation, the pressure is on the government to find support. At this point, the pressure is on all opposition parties, maybe not the Greens, but certainly the NDP, the Conservatives for sure, or even the Bloc Québécois, to actually give this a pass, and that pressure comes from allies who are premiers in provinces like BC in the case of the NDP, or Alberta, Ontario in the case of the Conservatives, and even Quebec in the case of the Bloc Québécois. So how often have you seen on an issue of major importance a unanimous press release from the premiers urging the opposition to support the government? I don't think I've seen many of those over the past few years.
Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen with every piece of legislation they have, that's for sure. Althea.
Well, there is no other piece of legislation like this. I mean, what's special about the new NAFTA is that they can't really amend it. Nobody in their right minds think that a parliamentarian in Canada is going to force things to be reopened in Washington, have Donald Trump decide to reopen this deal in Mexico as well. So there is the government has more leverage than it will ever have on any other piece of legislation that is likely to come in front of this minority government.
That's a good point.
The Greens did vote to support this, and so when Chrystia Freeland talks about a broad coalition, she definitely has one. But what was interesting is that on the same day that the Ways and Means motion happened, yesterday, Wednesday, there was also another vote where you saw how things usually play out in a minority government, which is the opposition voted together to call on the Auditor General to investigate the $188 billion infrastructure plan the Liberals have put forward and have been criticized for not seeing progress as quickly as possible. So it was very interesting to see, like, this is an example of how perhaps minority governments and minority parliaments can work, that you have people who, on one thing, on issue by issue, you have different dance partners.
Yeah. Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, practically and politically, there aren't a lot of reasons for the opposition to choose this hill to die on. Both because, as Althea says, it's too late to make changes to the bill, but also politically, I think everyone is sort of satisfied that this is what the deal is, and the government did, from the very start, did a fairly good job of sort of covering its bases and bringing in Conservative and NDP voices to make sure that they were sort of planning the bill in a way that it would, or planning the deal in a way that it could get domestic support. I think there is, though, for the government, it's a nice way to start, I guess, to sort of play the greatest hits and go, hey, look, we settled NAFTA. But there is now, I think, this real need to sort of move forward and start putting some things in the window that really build out an agenda for this Parliament. That's, this government gave itself a lot of time to get ready, a lot of time to transition, and there really is now, I think you can feel sort of a vacuum that has to be filled with some new measures.
Yeah. I want to do one go around on the Conservative Party quite quickly, and we'll do more for the podcast. But it was again this week about the people who didn't want to run. So my question, it's not simple, but why does no one actually want this job? Or very few people seem to want this job, Chantal.
Well, perhaps because it's not an entry-level position, for one. For two, the hurdles to having a campaign that is valid and that has the money to show for it are pretty significant. I think the problem the Conservatives are having is that their campaign is not dying but doing badly on the field of expectations, because they had the dream campaign and it was a dream. And now they're back down to earth, and maybe it's not totally as exciting as when people imagined Rana Ambrose and Jean Charest having this great fight to the finish.
Yeah, there do seem to be people sort of disappointed that the drama is not quite what they expected. 20 seconds, Althea and Aaron. Althea.
I think people think they can't win, and that's why they're not throwing their name in their hat in the ring. Like, you look at Peter MacKay is like a huge figure in the party, and he's been basically kind of paving that road for several years now, and the challenge is quite enormous, especially if you have no name recognition or you're in, you can't win this without being, I think, already present nationally, and there aren't that many people who fit that bill.
Yeah, Aaron.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of sort of people that have looked at this party and decided they can't win a leadership race, people who would rather be tending to their families or to their jobs in the private sector, and then to a certain amount of just a lack of succession planning maybe in the Harper years. I don't know that Stephen Harper really spent a lot of time thinking about preparing a cohort of ministers who might pick up the job after he left. And I think maybe you're seeing a bit of that gap now.
I'm asking for your support to take on and beat Justin Trudeau. I'm in politics to fight for you, and I need you to fight alongside me for Canada.
And that's why I'm standing here today, again, to announce my candidacy for the leadership of the Conservative Party of Canada.
Chantal, Althea, Aaron back for an extended round of At Issue. Just heard from the two of the Conservative leadership contenders there, Peter MacKay, Aaron O'Toole. Both launched their campaigns a few days ago. So let's talk a little bit more about the race. I'm going to start where Chantal wants to start, and we can go back to some of the issues that came up this week. But let's start on the carbon tax. Just today, Peter MacKay, on Thursday, Peter MacKay tweeted, I think he tweeted in the third person, I can't remember the exact language, but he said Peter MacKay is against a carbon tax. And I wondered if by that statement you think, Chantal, that the conversation then around how the Conservative government approaches climate change is essentially over, and we are back to where we were with Stephen Harper and Andrew Scheer.
Well, it wasn't just Peter MacKay, it was also Aaron O'Toole and other candidates. And bottom line, this conversation is not going to be taking place within the framework of the leadership campaign. And the Conservatives federally apparently still plan to go in the next election, promising to roll back the climate change framework of the Liberals, which by then will be pretty entrenched in many areas of the country. So it's an interesting backward-looking move. And at the same time, it exposes the Conservative Party federally going forward to being left the last party standing to come to a carbon tax, because over that period, chances are that maybe some Conservative premiers will come around to having a carbon tax of their own instead of the federal one, so that they get the revenues from it.
Yeah, I mean, it sure sounds like we're heading in that direction. Even Brian Pallister seems certainly more open to it than he was just a few months ago. So does that mean there's not even going to be a substantive debate, would you think, Althea, on climate change, or it's just this idea that you can't be a Conservative and believe in carbon tax, carbon pricing, whatever you want to call it?
No. I think that Mr. MacKay had probably felt like he needed to take this position because so many people in Alberta, not just in Alberta, but especially in Alberta, really believe that this is a non-starter. They would not vote for a candidate that was not in opposition to a carbon tax on consumers. And a lot of people in the Conservative Party also believe that a carbon tax on consumers is not a good idea, and there are better ways, whether that's nuclear to meet some carbon targets. I don't think the Conservative Party is like an anti-green party. I think that we are probably going to have a discussion about climate and being a global player. Like, we heard that a lot through Andrew Scheer, but we're not going to have the type of discussion that we had when Michael Chong was in the contest, because he was proposing something that was radically different. At the moment, none of the candidates, but we have like 4 or 5 months left to go, have distinguished themselves on this issue.
Aaron, how do you? Yeah, go ahead, Chantal.
But it does mean that the next probable Conservative leader will go in the next federal campaign promising to roll back the federal climate change policy.
Yeah.
And by the way, maybe, yes, Alberta's mood on this is clear, but this is a debate that the Liberals actually won in Ford Nation territory in Ontario, where the Conservatives do need to do better, and this won't be an ace up the sleeve of the party next time, as it was not this time.
I mean, I hate to be too cynical, but I assume that also, we're saying this now, but it's quite possible that whoever becomes leader doesn't have the same policies when it comes to the election.
I was going to say that. I mean, it's one thing to get elected within the Conservative Party saying you're going to get rid of that. It's another thing to then run on that in an election. I agree that would be complicated. But Aaron, let me hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think it's possible that all three of these leadership candidates, Mr. O'Toole, Mr. McKay, and Ms. Gladue, are making somewhat of a wager that by the time of the next election, this is effectively a settled question because the Supreme Court has upheld the federal price and the provinces have moved on, and the carbon prices debate is effectively moot. I think, though, the problem becomes it's not just that you oppose a carbon tax. That wasn't Andrew Scheer's problem. Wasn't necessarily that he opposed the carbon tax. Andrew Scheer's problem was that he couldn't replace it with a plan that met Canada's targets. And that's where the crux of the issue is. And once you've taken carbon pricing off the table, you've taken effectively the most cost-effective measure off the table. So what are you going to replace it with? How do you meet the targets, and how do you do it in a way that's less costly than the current Liberal plan? Those are the kind of questions the Conservatives end up having to grapple with. I think it's fine at this point for them to say they won't implement a carbon tax. I suspect that's a sort of defensive position they're all taking to get themselves through the leadership. But it's the what else that they're going to have to face either now or 2 years from now or whenever the next election is.
But to your point, if they've taken off the measure that most economists in the world believe is the most effective and efficient measure to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, I'm not sure what combination of things that you could put together that would be as effective. I'm sure maybe there is one, but I don't know what that would be. Chantal?
Oh, it's not only that. If you are saying you're going to roll it back, unless you're assuming that Alberta and Ontario will sign on and have their own carbon tax in 24 months, you're basically dismantling the policy that is in place. It's not just something you say. So are we saying here that it's okay for them to say that now because it's going to be like the eliminate the GST promise once they're in power? They're just going to say, forget all that, I didn't mean it. Because if that's what we're saying, I'm sorry, but I'm not paid to cover leadership candidates on the basis that they don't mean what they say.
No, I agree. That was us being deeply cynical that maybe they would use it to their advantage, not suggesting that they do it. Can we do one go around before I let you go on the Pride Parade issues? A lesser issue, certainly, but also one where they all took a stand, or the vast majority of them took a stand, the well-known people took a stand about attending Pride Parades, which is significant. But it did sort of beg the question, too, about, okay, well, is that enough, or do you have to back it up with some other things? Althea, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think the question is, if you suddenly have decided you have a kumbaya moment and these pride parades are very important to you, then why didn't you march in them earlier? I think for a lot of people, walking in a pride parade doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go to bat and support their rights, and they'd be more interested in having an advocate and somebody who's willing to speak out in favor of their rights and fight discrimination in Parliament than they are about walking in the parade. But for others, it really does mean something. I mean, it's interesting to see where the party has gone in just 4 or 5 months.
Totally.
Because this is not the discussion we were having in August and in September.
But it is a sign, Aaron, that it could not continue down this path, that at very least you had to say, well, I'll do this. But I agree with Althea. I mean, you have to see what else there is. But it is a sign that something had to change between what happened and what Andrew Scheer was campaigning on and where they're headed. At least on some issues, because I guess on climate change, no. But go ahead.
Yeah, I do. I mean, political parties don't stick with what they think is going to work up until the moment it doesn't, and then suddenly they decide they have a different position. I don't want to downplay the importance of marching in a pride parade, but it does feel like the very least you could do at this point to differentiate yourself from Andrew Scheer and show that you accept all people in this country would be to march in a pride parade. I think there's more to do. I think there's far more to do in that area. But I do think that, further to Chantal's point, people who may be happy to see Conservative leaders marching in pride parades would also probably like to see a climate change plan that gets Canada to its international targets. And so simply marching in a pride parade is, let's say, the very least you could do at this point.
Okay, Chantal, on that point.
I find the notion that you suddenly discover an affection for pride parades about as strong an expression of sincerity as promising to walk in the June 24th Saint Jean-Baptiste parade without bothering to learn French properly when you apply to be Prime Minister.
Okay, on that point, we'll leave it there. Thank you all for all of that this week. I appreciate it. Chantal, Althea, and Aaron.